thing we have to fear is
in war,
fear itself.
there is no substitute for victory.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
We stand undivided, forever united, fighting hand in hand for the liberty we've earned, for glory and honor, for our sons and daughters, ever mindful of the lessons we've learned. Let the torch of freedom burn.
You found your way to the intersection of faith and politics. WallBuilders Live with David Barton and Rick Green. Thank you for joining us today. Visit online at wallbuilders.com and wallbuilderslive.com. Looking at things from a perspective both biblically and historically. And David, as we look at the culture that we're in right now, we see so many issues, so many problems. Seems like there's probably a common underlying reason for the decay that we're seeing.
Yeah, there is. And, you know, George Mason, who was the father of the Bill of Rights, one of the 55 guys who helped put together the Constitution, and then he left the Constitutional Convention and said, we need to restrain the federal government even more, so he's called the father of the Bill of Rights. He made a statement so great that it's still recorded in the Virginia Constitution to this day, which he helped write back before the Declaration of Independence even. And he said the only way you can preserve liberty is by frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. He said the only way you keep this thing going is you got to keep going back to the basics time after time after time after time. And some of the basics for a civilized society that we forget about are actually all around us. If you go inside the U.S. Supreme Court, you will find, for example, inside the U.S. Supreme Court that there's nearly 60 depictions of the Ten Commandments. If you look at the seal of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, they've got the Ten Commandments as part of their court seal. If you look at the Federal District Court in Washington, D.C., it's got the Ten Commandments on the outside. If you go to the Transportation Building, the Ronald Reagan Transportation Building, it's got the Ten Commandments on the outside.
Well, are you suggesting the Ten Commandments have something to do with our foundation or our law? Surely not. I mean, that's surely by accident that they have all
Well,
those.
you know, that's why for 2 centuries in America, it was easier to find the Ten Commandments in civil buildings than it was church buildings. But we're at the point now that that's not a good deal anymore because church people don't know what the Ten Commandments are now. And so there's so many things that go with the Ten Commandments. One of the books that we reprinted and that we sell at WallBuilders is Noah Webster's Advice to the Young. And in it, he goes through the Ten Commandments and talks about how they apply, and it's very practical. He says, young people, the command, thou shalt not steal, is real simple. He said, if you're going by somebody's orchard and you see an apple on the ground, you can't pick that up. It doesn't belong to you. You didn't pay for it. Yeah, it's on the ground, but you can't. You're stealing. He said, and by the way, if you agree to work 10 hours for someone and you only work 9 hours and 45 minutes, you've stolen 15 minutes from. And he just went through and gave all this stuff on what it means, thou shalt not steal. And then we've got an 1840s book that was reprinted in 1890 that we reprinted called Ethics, and about not bearing false witness. It gives 6 different ways that you can lie. Now, I didn't know there was that many ways to lie, and you read them, well, there's exaggeration, there's understatement, there's omission. And so we've really come to the point where that even as Christians, we don't know the Ten Commandments well enough to apply them, because if we did, we wouldn't have many societal problems. And this is not a matter of living by the law. You get in your heart things that, you know what, profanity is not needed, and lying and exaggeration, understatement, omission is not needed. You can speak the truth. And you know what? Respect for private property and respect for the hours on a time card and not exaggerating on the amount of money I turn into my insurance company because I want greater. So all that's stealing. And so that really is going back to fundamentals. And going back to that fundamental is really an important thing.
And if we're not learning that in the church, we're not studying that, if we don't know that in the church, we can't expect the culture to reflect that either. Stephen McDowell from Providence Foundation is going to talk with us a little bit about this subject. Stay with us here on WallBuilders Live.
I'm Professor Radisson. This is Philosophy 150. Fill in the papers I've just given you with 3 little words. God is dead.
When your faith is tested, would you fight for what you believe?
I actually believe in God.
To me, he's not dead. He's alive.
God's not dead. He's surely alive.
God's Not Dead, the movie. Join the movement at the box office and say, God's not dead. He's surely alive. Now playing. Rated PG. For more information, go to godsnotdeadthemovie.com.
Let the torch of freedom
Welcome back to the intersection of faith and politics. WallBuilders Live with David Barton and Rick Green. Thanks for staying with us. Stephen McDowell, our good friend from Providence Foundation, with us today. Stephen, always good to have you, bro. Thanks for coming back on.
Well, thank you, Rick. It's great to be with you.
Hey, we've been talking about this issue of just losing our law, our respect for law, our respect for right and wrong, and how we really are becoming a lawless nation. And you're working on a book on this, and you're really getting to the core of the matter. It's as simple as we used to teach the Ten Commandments. We don't anymore. Why would we follow them if we're not even teaching them?
Yeah, you're right. As so many examples around us today of how America is becoming a lawless nation. And I believe the primary reason that is because the church, God's people, have put aside the law. In particular, we put aside God's moral law as revealed in the Ten Commandments. And if the church, God's people, don't adhere to the standard fundamental law that applies to all men and nations, how could we ever expect our civil society to adhere to those principles?
I guess if we're supposed to be the salt and light and we've lost our flavor, there it goes, and there's no way the culture is going to follow that. Let's back up and talk about lawless nation. You know, like you said, lots of examples. I mean, whether you're talking about the knockout game, these thugs on the street that walk up to strangers and pummel them, or you're talking about a president who ignores the Constitution. It's all the way across the board. And now we have Christians making arguments for why gay marriage is okay and why that, forget what the Bible says, that doesn't matter. I saw a quote from a big pastor the other day saying we just need to affirm people wherever they are. How far do we take that, Stephen? If you affirm people whatever they do, that there is no law?
Well, right. Jesus certainly forgave the sinner, but he also said, go and sin no more. There is a standard that Jesus, the gospel, the Bible holds up, that there is right and there is wrong. God reveals that to us and expects us to base our life and society upon those precepts. And so if we as the church cast aside his standard, then we have big trouble.
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt about it. So how do we even begin to turn the tide on this? If you're seeing so many, and again, we're not talking about people outside the church. We're talking about people within the church, pastors and part of the evangelical community. We see the church ignoring this and moving away from this and redefining God's law. Where do we start? I mean, how do we begin to change this?
Well, we obviously have to begin by the church, God's people, beginning to understand his basic law. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that the schoolrooms in Kentucky could not post the Ten Commandments on the walls because they said that if you have them posted there, the children might see them. If they see them, they might read them. And if they read them, they might obey them. Well, heaven forbid if our citizens would obey the commands to not murder, not steal, honor authority, etc. But they were
that kind of sounds like a pretty good plan to me, to actually have them obey. I'm sitting here going, why would your government actually say we don't want the people in our country to see and obey? That's mind-boggling. But
it's foolish. We have 2.2 million people in jail today. If we would teach them don't steal, don't defraud, don't murder, we would get most of them out of jail. So it's a foolish concept to put aside these standards that they're not just the standard for the Christian faith, but they're standard for all men. But the problem, we've pulled them off our schoolroom walls because they were first taken off of the walls of God's people. In 1997, there was a huge gathering in Washington, D.C., the Promise Keepers Men's Prayer Event Rally, where some 1 million men gathered together to seek God in prayer. That these were, sincere, devoted followers of his. And I had a friend who took a survey of 500 of these promise-keeping men, and he asked them to list the Ten Commandments in the order that they appear in their Bible. Order is not necessarily important. It just shows you have a basic knowledge of these principles.
Yeah.
Now, how many of those 500 men do you think could name the Ten Commandments in the order in their Bible?
Man, I'm going to guess maybe 100.
Well, no, there was one.
One?
One person could name them in order. Now, if God's people don't know his basic moral standards of how to live, basic moral teaching, then no wonder we've got a problem. So the solution, as you asked earlier, has to begin by we as God's people learning these commands, understanding these commands, living these commands, teaching them to our children as well. You know, because we used to do this everywhere, because the Ten Commandments formed the foundation of our civil law in America. They were the central focal point of education. They were contained in the textbooks that we use, not just in churches, but textbooks in our schools. The New England Primer sold 5 million copies, the most prominent textbook in the 1700s. It had in there contained a catechism, the 40% of which taught these moral commandments of God. Webster's Blueback Speller that sold 100 million copies during the 1800s, and it contains over 100 different, sentences that teach or reinforce these moral commands of honor your parents, don't steal, don't lie, and other things that commandments contain. The McGuffey's Reader sold 122 million copies. It has, not only does it reinforce these moral standards, it has lesson on the Ten Commandments. So that, my point is that everybody, even the non-Christian, were exposed to these standards in their educational institutions, in the church. And that's why they then carried them into the civil arena and said, yes, this needs to be the standard for how our society lives as well. And so gradually they began to be removed from the laws of the heart of God's people, and then more recently we've seen them taken off our courtroom walls, and judges actually kicked out of office who wanted to put them on their walls. We've seen them removed from our schoolroom walls, and hence now the major battles we're fighting as a society deal with these principles, of that God put forth in the commandments. What is the family? Moral behavior, and other things. Those are the battles that we fight, and if to deal with to answer those, we need to begin to teach God's moral principles.
So in the past, then, it was reinforced everywhere you went. You were immersed in it as a child in your education, and then those things were reinforced throughout the culture. And so as you grew up, if you became a leader, it was already in your heart, and so it was just natural you understood, and your mind, you intellectually understood why those things were important to having a good culture. So the culture reflected that. So we've gone back, and by taking it out of the schools and taking it out of the education, you end up with a new generation now, I guess maybe 2 generations, well, maybe 3, because we really started doing this, I guess that Ten Commandments case was in 1980, but we've been trying to get God out and these morals out for so long that we probably have 3 generations now that have been raised without these basic principles. And like you said, even within the church, we don't know them.
Yeah, that's right, and that's why, a underlying tenet of modern government schools is this idea of relativism. There is no truth. All things are relative. You're your own standard for what you can consider to be lawful or unlawful, moral or immoral. And so relativism has, as the Ten Commandments, God's moral standard, these absolutes that apply to all men and nations throughout all of history, if they have been taken out, then we've substituted this idea of, well, everything's relative. You can't be so restrictive and tell me it's wrong to live in immorality or redefine the family or even take what I might need to have, even if it is taking from someone else. After all, I'm without. So there's so many ways that we've violated these commands because a lot of American citizens today don't see that it's wrong because we haven't taught that it's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can almost, I bet you could take the Ten Commandments and you could chart every societal ill we have, every problem we're facing from a policy point of view, even in government. And where a bad policy is messing up our nation, you could chart it to a violation of one of the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That's true, because you have to realize that the Ten Commandments, they were given to the children of Israel through Moses when God wrote them with his finger on those tablets. While he revealed them that way, the knowledge of those moral laws existed from the beginning. Adam and Eve knew that moral law. But it's interesting that God stated the commandments in the negative. Most 9 of the 10 were really in the negative. You shall not steal. You shall not murder. You shall not covet what your neighbor has. And God did that on purpose because it restricts a specific behavior which then if a citizen acts that way, civil government can get involved to stop that one specific behavior. But it's not stated in the positive, because the idea of the positive conception of law is a Roman idea. You know, the Roman idea is that, well, if for man's well-being, we as the government are going to get involved, legislate, and enact things. So under that guise, everything comes under the well-being of man. You know, you must eat this particular type of food because it's for your well-being. You know, you must, take your children and send to government schools because it's for the good, their good, and the good of society. So it's that positive concept of law, which was the Roman idea, gets government involved in our life in a way God never intended it to. Now, that being said, it was stated in the negative, every one of those commandments has a positive corollary. You know, for example, when it says, you shall not steal, that implies that we have private property rights. We have a God-given right to own material things, to labor, which, by the way, the fourth commandment says you shall work 6 days and rest on the seventh. So that's an integral command, working and laboring. That labor is a way that we acquire property. And so these property rights are a part of the Ten Commandments of God and are fundamental for economic prosperity. They used to be a vital part of America's economic system, and those are other rights that we're giving away today. The government is encroaching upon our right to govern our own property and govern our own land. They try to come in through EPA regulations and tell us you can't, move some soil from one part of your land to the other because you might, it's a mess up pollute the land or something. But so your point is that about every one of the major problems we face today regarding marriage, property rights, welfare, crime,
even health care. That's a we're coveting. I want health care as good as you, or I want better. Everybody wants this radical egalitarianism. It's violating the 10th.
We're not contented with what our state in life, in the sense that we've got to have something else, and I'm going to use the force of government to get it.
And maybe even this, you could probably say the way that we're overriding people's rights of conscience and their religious beliefs is violate. We're now making graven images, or we're forcing them not to acknowledge God. So even there, you could go back to the first and second.
Yeah, so it's vital that we teach a thorough understanding of these basic moral principles, their negative statement as well as their positive corollaries to American citizens, because without that, we cannot live as a free people.
So let me ask you this real quick, Stephen, before we run out of time. Now, you're working on a book on this. We want to have you back when the book is done. But for now, what about pastors that are listening in churches? I mean, how many pastors do you think actually preach on the Ten Commandments these days?
Well, I would be interested to have some kind of survey. I've kind of done my own poll and found very few churches have any systematic means of imparting God's basic moral law. Now, of course, if you teach any moral principle in the New Testament, every one of them are rooted in these Ten Commandments. But I don't know of any that have regular training courses, Sunday school courses, a class. Let's teach the Ten Commandments. I'm sure there may be, but I think I have actually talked to one pastor that they have done something like that.
Is that where we need to start? I mean, it's got to start in the church, right?
Yeah,
and in the home.
Right.
I mean, parents right now could say, "Hey, I'm going to start, finding ways to teach my kids this, get them to learn it from an early age." But the church has got to take a role here.
Yes, and that's why I'm actually producing two things. I'm working on a little book that talks about the Ten Commandments in general, but then I'm doing a Bible study also that is designed to be used in churches or anywhere else, that will actually lead you through, here's the Scripture, what does the Scripture say regarding, each of these both negative and positive aspects of the Ten Commandments. So this I think, will be a great tool that any church can use on an ongoing basis to teach people the fundamental moral laws of God.
Well, man, we're looking forward to you getting it out. We need it. This is not a Oh, it's not an overnight short-term thing. This is something that's really going to take a generation to get ingrained again, and almost a habit of making this an important part of what we teach, and that it gives us our whole worldview for how our culture is going to work. But it's going to take some time. But man, I appreciate where you're starting, and we're looking forward to when should we expect to have you back?
Well, I hope to have this just in a few months. Have these things completed.
Well, in the meantime, you've got a lot of great material at Providence Foundation, so let's at least give out the website today and people will know where to go and be looking for it.
ProvidenceFoundation.com. We actually already do have a little booklet on the Ten Commandments that if people can't wait, they can get a copy of that right now before we have all this other material available. It's ProvidenceFoundation.com.
Good stuff. Go check it out there, folks. Stephen, always a pleasure to have you. Look forward to having you back when the materials are ready as well.
Thanks a lot, Rick.
Back in a moment with David Barton. Red, White, Blue, and Green is a new reality show following the Green family around the nation, rediscovering the American principles that made us the most successful nation in the history of the world. You can be a part of launching this new reality series by visiting rickgreen.com and clicking on the Red, White, Blue, and Green tab. Here's a sneak peek from the pilot episode. Rick Green coming to you live from the Lone Star State of Texas, a beacon of hope and freedom to liberty lovers around the world. Today I'm thinking about why do we do what we do? Because everywhere we go as a family, when we're traveling and speaking, someone comes up to us and asks, where's the hope? Is it over for America? They genuinely feel like the stars and stripes are fading. I felt that. But when I look at my family, whether it's my son Trey and his drive to exceed expectations, or Reagan and his love for serving and teaching other people, Cameron and her determination to outperform her brothers in everything she does, or my little stagehound Rhett and his boundless enthusiasm. Through their eyes, I see a vibrant nation. When my children stand in the birthplace of the Constitution, or on battlefields where patriots gave their lives, I can see in them a rekindled flame of the American spirit. The future of my children's country is bright because it's built on the foundation of an incredible providential history. A history of patriots and pastors, entrepreneurs and freedom fighters, mothers, fathers, families like yours and mine, who chose to live like their nation depended on it. And it still does. So when people ask us, where is the hope? We tell them, it's in you. Each of us, every individual, every family, has a duty to fight for freedom and add our voice, our color, to the American dream. For our family, it's red, white, and blue, and a little bit of green. To learn more about Red, White, Blue, and Green, visit rickgreen.com.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us here on WallBuilders Live. Back with David Barton now. David, great summary of the basics that we need to get back to and where we need to start. I was always thinking, government. He's saying, hey, first it's got to start with us. That's right. And in the church.
And it's thinking, too, because you made a comment. You pointed out the ridiculous thing that a pastor of a really big megachurch said, we need to affirm people wherever they are. And that is one of the bad thinking things that has to change in our society for us to be biblical again. And I'll go back to another one that I hate. I despise this statement. I hear it in churches all the time that God hates sin, but he loves the sinner. Yeah. I'm sorry. If you refuse to separate yourself from your sin, that hate gets directed at you too. He loves you, but if you won't separate from sin, and I'll just go real simply to Proverbs 6, where it says, these 6 things does the Lord hate, yea, 7 are detestable to him. It says a false witness who pours out lies. And he didn't say he hated lies.
It's not the lie, it's the witness.
He hated the witness who poured out lies.
Yeah, great.
And it says, and a person who stirs up conflict in the community. It's not the conflict, it's the person that stirs up the conflict that he hates. And then you go through Deuteronomy 18, you find out that he hates enchanters and witches and charmers and wizards and necromancers. And Psalms 5 says he hates the workers of iniquity. And Psalms 11 says he hates those who love violence. And Proverbs 16 says he hates the proud in heart. And it sounds to me like that's not just the pride he's hating. He's hating those that have it in their heart and embrace it.
That doesn't sound very politically correct,
It's
David.
not politically correct. But
it's correct.
It's biblically correct. And if the church doesn't start thinking like that, see, that's what causes you not to tolerate a bunch of bad behavior. Because you say, well, it's bad behavior, but I love the person who did it, so I can tolerate the behavior. No, if you learn to reject the behavior, and if a person won't separate himself from that behavior, if he's a perpetual liar, if he's a perpetual child molester, whatever, you got to learn to hate that as well.
Yeah.
And so that's part of what has to change. But I love what Steve said about, just a really simple thing is just memorize the 10 Commandments. Learn them in order. And I was thinking about learning them in order, and I thought, that's a good point. And then, and by the way, people may not know, but the Supreme Court has pointed out, the great theologians there are 4 different versions of the 10 Commandments. You have the Jewish version, the Catholic version, the Protestant version, the Orthodox version. I personally like the Jewish version because command number 1 says, I am the Lord thy God. In the Protestant version, that's just the preamble to the 10 Commandments. But the Jewish version says, if you don't start with the fact that he is God, then there's not a real reason you shouldn't commit adultery. There's not a real reason you shouldn't lie. So I like that Jewish version, but I got to admit, the one that I've got hanging in my house is the cowboy version of the 10 Commandments.
I was just looking that up. I love it. Okay, let's hear it.
Here you go.
We're on the same page here, bro.
Command number 1, just one God. Command, here's one, honor your ma and your pa. Here's one, no fooling around with another fellow's gal.
There you go.
Here's one, watch your mouth. Here's one, don't take what ain't yours. I mean, these are all good ones, and they incorporate the 10 Commandments, but they're just practical. So,
how about the don't covet one? It's don't be hankering for your buddy's stuff.
That's right. Don't be hankering for your buddy's stuff. It's exactly right. And it's
the principle's
exactly
there,
the
right?
principle's there. But memorize them in order. So whatever version you get, that's an assignment. Learn the 10 Commandments yourself. Like he said, only 1 out of 500 guys at Promise Keepers could name them in order.
Wow.
And so we need to know those 10 Commandments.
All of us, and teach our kids as well. Thanks for listening today. You've been listening to WallBuilders Live.
We stand undivided.